US tariffs have renewed Canadian patriotism, but only civic awareness can take this beyond a shallow sentiment. Civic literacy and participation have eroded for decades, but patriotism was really set back in 2015. That year, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Residential Schools referred to Canada as a genocidal nation. The political left picked up the idea, using critical discourses against Canadian culture and history to further expose the alleged rottenness. What better way to delegitimate a country than to label it genocidal? Who would want to live in such a country? The destruction of Sir John A. Macdonald statues and the renaming of schools and even a university in Toronto is a rational response to this Manichaean message. If patriotism is a basis for future-directed political action, as we have seen more recently, delegitimating our Canadian regime as we have for the past decade renders it incapable of action or even existence. Nevertheless, patriotic sentiment has found new life following 25% tariffs imposed by US President Donald Trump. Some premiers and federal politicians have presented themselves as Captain Canuck figures defending the frightened, angry, and anxious Canadian nation. Melodramatic, sentimentalist Canadian patriotism manifests in social media slacktivism and virtue signaling, hockey fandom and anthem booing, consumption of non-American alcohol, and Rambo insurgency. This nationalism is visceral and sub-rational, but real patriotism is reflective. It contains a critical element that always asks whether the political community is living up to its ideals. This constitutional patriotism, a term coined by Yale University political science professor Stephen Smith, is something Canadian educators have failed to teach. It requires loyalty to responsible government, including the forms of Crown and Parliament. The preamble of the Constitution Act of 1867, also known as the British North America Act, announces itself as a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. This proclamation is the quintessential Canadian statement of patriotism and the kind of piety Cicero extolled. This brief phrase proclaims the Canadian Constitution a descendant of the English Constitution, which has its roots going back hundreds of years, at least to the Magna Carta. The Canadian Constitution, like its parent, is the work of hundreds of generations of statesmen, jurists, and citizens alike. For patriotism to mean more than sentimental loyalty, Canadians must understand their Constitution and its ideals. Any patriotism not habitually formed by our parliamentary institutions is little more than a blind, unformed, and vague sentiment. Nor can Canadians be patriotic if they continue to neglect the volunteer and charitable sector that does so much heavy lifting in our communities for many causes and persons, especially for the needy. Few Canadians will become members of Parliament, so we don't all need to understand parliamentary procedure. But our founders also recognized a liberal democracy requires an active citizenry capable of practicing political virtues including deliberation, practical wisdom, and justice. They encourage citizens to practice those virtues in smaller venues, including volunteer organizations, local government, student councils, church councils, and governing boards of charitable organizations. We might moderate our political polarization if we take responsibility for improving our neighborhoods and participate in the face-to-face and collective deliberations, discussions, and choices that a parliamentary people are called upon to make. Americans are far ahead at reviving civic education. They have responded to the same pathologies the US shares with Canada that have prompted people to knock down statues of historic leaders. State legislators have dedicated large amounts of funding to schools and institutes of civic thought and leadership. This has led to a renaissance in civic and liberal education at flagship state public universities in Arizona, Texas, Florida, Iowa, Tennessee, North Carolina, Ohio, and Utah. The Jarislowsky Chairs in Trust and Political Leadership, established in 5 Canadian universities, including my own in Lethbridge, are the start of something similar here. The American model for schools of civics is gaining traction, a viable option for Canadian universities. If you really want to defend Canada, pick up a copy of Canada's Founding Debates. Find out why those who devised Confederation thought our system of responsible government protected the rights of minorities better than the American presidential system. Maybe it still can. Support Canadian scholarship and study it closely in a patriotic and liberal spirit, then dive into the rich tradition of political and constitutional thought that informs our regime of responsible government. Read Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Tocqueville, and other voices of political wisdom. The pursuit of wisdom is the greatest emblem of your freedom. Let's make responsible government great again.